Everything okay? He heard the doctor's voice just as he put the last of his belongings into the small backpack, and Kyle froze for a moment. His vision blurred for a second as he blinked, and slowly raised his head and felt a slight pain growing inside his skull again. He nodded and turned his head to look at her. Her eyes were as bright and clear as the first time he had seen her. She didn't look at him like he was damaged goods or a hopeless case. No. And for that, he was thankful. You know, I've hardly ever seen anyone handle such an injury like you. There's something inside of you that's really admirable. If the rest of my patients were this determined to get better, my job would be much easier. That was a lie. He knew it, and so did she. But Dr. Stein still smiled so brightly, so comfortably, that he couldn't help but believe it, if only for a second. "Thank you," he replied, then lowered his head again, enduring that aching pain every time he moved, to make sure that everything was packed and nothing would be left behind. Traumatic brain injury. What a strange word, he thought. It's what one gets if a brick comes falling down a few floors on a construction site and strikes one right on top of the head. If he hadn't been wearing his hard hat, he would have entered this hospital a few floors below, in the morgue. With it, his skull had gotten split open from his frontal lobe back along the top of his head. He could still feel those metal staples in his scalp. But he had survived. At least, part of him. He thought with a sad smile, and kept his face turned downward to hide it from Dr. Stein. Those past weeks had been brutal. He was still relearning some things, like carefully opening packaging or walking without wobbling. But compared to where he had started, he had already improved by leaps and bounds. And because of that, today would be his last day here in the hospital. From now on, he could finally go back to his old life. Well, what was left of it, at least. His partner had already left him, which was as sad as it was expected. They hadn't been doing great beforehand, and this accident had just been the last thing in a long line of problems. There wasn't much of his family to speak of either. He wasn't in contact with his parents or siblings, and didn't want to be, if he was honest. A few friends had turned up at the hospital from time to time, work colleagues and even his boss. He had promised him that his job would be waiting for him the second he felt ready to return. Which was nice. Even though Kyle was sure some lawyer upstairs must have had his hands in that interaction. They were probably scared shitless that he would sue them. And rightfully so. After all, the accident had occurred during his work. And there had been some problems with the construction site. Would he talk to a lawyer? Well, that was definitely a conversation for another time. Right now, he wanted to go home to his apartment and enjoy a bit of peace and quiet for once. You still remember what to look out for, right? The doctor asked him, and Kyle nodded. Sudden shooting pain. Blood that starts trickling out. Loss of motor function. A whole list of stuff like that. He was aware, and he would call an ambulance if any of those symptoms appeared. And if there's anything else you need to get off your chest, you can call and ask for me directly. Okay? Now Kyle smiled for real and lifted his head before nodding. Yeah, she had been treating him well all those weeks, and he truly was thankful to her. But it was time for him to get back to his normal life. Rebuild what he had lost. He closed up the backpack and pulled its strap over one shoulder. Dr. Stein stood by the open door and never smiled while he walked past her and out into the hallway of the hospital. He could see another patient, looking at him with wide-open eyes as he passed by. Maybe he should buy a few caps, stuff like that. Something to cover up the staples and the scar he would bear for the rest of his life. Well, he could think about that once he was back home in his apartment. Right now, he didn't care at all about what other people thought of him. So he smiled and nodded and passed the patient by. The whole walk through the hospital was like that. People were staring at him. Mostly the healthy-looking ones, maybe family members of patients or the like. But sometimes he could also see those in wheelchairs or old people walking around with their infusions shooting him glances. His resolve started to crack as he hurried past the last group with his head lowered and out the automatic doors. A man was standing by the entrance, openly staring at him. Kyle felt a chill as he noticed him out of the corner of his eye. The guy wasn't wearing a hospital gown, but street clothing. But even at a quick glance, he could see that something was terribly wrong with him. There was a cut across his chest, from his hip bone up to his shoulder. But he didn't even seem to be in a great amount of pain. Whatever. Not my problem, he whispered to himself, looked around the hospital's entrance, and soon spotted a taxi idling by the side of the main road. He waved it down, jumped in, and gave the driver the address, happy to be out of the public for once. Kyle looked back at the entrance of the hospital, but the man still stood. He hadn't gone in yet, wasn't smoking a cigarette out there, or even seemed to be in a hurry to go anywhere. Why was no one with him? Where were the doctors, nurses, or staff to get him inside? That wound on his chest looked horrible. He could see the man's eyes narrow as they met his, but the taxi already drove off before anything else could happen. That was strange, Kyle thought and shook his head. Something was going on here, and it irked him that he felt completely powerless to get to the bottom of it. He felt helpless, just like those days after he had woken up first. Without memories or even the ability to hold a thought for more than a few seconds. When everything had been a chore, when his mind had been jumbled and he had felt useless. Worse than at any other time in his life. He groaned almost silently, and saw the driver shooting him a glance as well. Maybe he should get a t-shirt made with the words, "I know what I look like," printed on the front and back in big, bold letters. Maybe that would stop the people from staring. He could feel this anger building inside of him. Just a few hours ago, he had thought it would all be fine, that those stares wouldn't get to him. He had survived, after all. But now, they really started to bother him. He turned his head away from the driver and looked out of the window. The streets around here were almost empty at this time, and he wasn't sure if he should feel glad about that or not. He thought he remembered them being fuller, but wasn't completely sure about that. Sometimes his memories still played tricks on him. Like after he had woken up, he could have sworn he had seen someone in a hospital gown walking by his bed. and stopping and staring at him. But the nurses had been adamant that no one had entered his room at all. Or when he had gone to the cafeteria the first time on his own, when he had stood behind someone in line, then suddenly found himself completely alone again. Or those times when he could have sworn he had heard children singing in the hospital, even though no one else had heard them. It was a process, Dr. Stein had told him. He shouldn't get impatient or try to improve too quickly. His mind was still healing, and he had to take special care not to hurt himself again. The taxi passed by a little shop close to the boardwalk, and suddenly Kyle felt a shooting pain right through his head. He remembered being here before, walking there, looking at... The pain flared up again, only this time worse. Something had happened here, before the accident. Something important. "Stop the car," he hissed at the man driving while he cradled his head. The migraine wasn't abating. It was getting worse and worse. Dr. Stein had warned him about that. It could happen if he tried too hard, she had told him. But the shaking of the car made the whole thing worse. He could feel the world spinning around him as he shut his eyes and held his head. This sight had started it all. The small shop. Kyle groaned and held his breath. In the darkness behind his eyelids, colors were dancing. A painful thunderstorm of shapes and forms. He could feel the safety belt cutting into his shoulder as the car rolled to a stop, but he couldn't concentrate on it. The pain in his head was all-encompassing. It took away everything, even his hearing. Maybe he had left the hospital too early, he thought, then suddenly felt a rush of anger as part of him pushed back hard against that idea. No. He needed to get back to his life. Sitting in the hospital bed, almost completely alone, would have killed him in the end. He had to be on his own to prove to himself that he still mattered. That he wasn't completely damaged and broken beyond repair. Kyle bit the inside of his cheek, then let out a long, loud groan and exhaled. The painful storm of vibrant colors disappeared, as did the migraine. He was in control, he told himself. No one else could tell him what was best for him. Not anymore. He opened his eyes and straightened up, still feeling kind of out of it, with the world slowly spinning around him. "Thanks. I need to get out of here," he whispered, pulled out 2 bills from his pocket and held them out to the man behind the steering wheel. The driver took the money, and Kyle pretty much jumped out of the car, still unsteady on his feet. He heard the door closing behind him, then the car setting off, while he took deep breaths and tried to find his bearings. If he managed to walk home from here, that would be a great first step, right? Kyle exhaled all the air in his lungs, then looked around. Only 2 people were standing by the boardwalk that ran along the river. He had walked this path more times than he could count. It would lead him home. But first, he had to do something. Sticking his hand into his pocket, he pulled out a few more bills, then set off toward the small shop whose sight had given him that mind-splitting headache. He was ready to turn and walk off in another direction if the pain started up again. But Kyle wanted to know what exactly had happened back in the car. Some part of him felt that it was important. He got closer and closer to the second-hand shop, and looking at it seemed to stir something inside of him. But he couldn't put his finger on what. Yes, he had been here before. That much was clear. But why had he reacted this badly in the car? Kyle reached the shop and quickly glanced inside. It was small, full of strange shirts and pants and other stuff he couldn't name on the spot. There was a counter in the back with a bored-looking woman standing behind it, staring down at her own phone. The migraine wasn't starting up again. He felt nothing right now. Kyle pushed open the door and could immediately see the woman behind the counter looking up at him. Her expression changed from boredom to annoyance to revulsion. He held her gaze only for a second before she quickly lowered her eyes. That's right, he thought, now feeling irritated himself as he walked over to one of the racks with caps on them. He took two randomly and then made his way to the counter. The woman wasn't looking at him anymore. She was now doing her best to ignore him. You think they'll fit me? Kyle asked, knowing that he was taking his frustration out on her, yet feeling strangely calm nonetheless. She hadn't done anything to him. A part of him warned. This wasn't how he should behave. The woman behind the counter didn't even react to his words. She simply took the caps, read the price tags, and held out her hand. Kyle stopped himself from saying anything else as he let the bill fall into her open palm, took the caps, and turned away again. He hadn't felt another spark in here either, and that fact was souring his mood even more. Had the migraine just been a coincidence? It could be. But he had felt like he could have found some missing piece of himself here. It felt like a rip-off. He let one of the caps fall into the backpack and cautiously put the other one on his head. The feeling of the cloth touching the metal staples almost made him recoil, but he couldn't let the woman at the counter see him twitch. He could tell that she was looking at him now that he had turned his back on her. Kyle groaned in his thoughts as he left the store behind and walked toward the boardwalk. It was still early in the morning, on a weekday, so it wasn't too surprising that there weren't many people around. Yet he couldn't help but feel that something was off. He could see a couple a bit off on one of the benches, and a single big guy standing by the railing looking out over the river. If he followed the boardwalk, he would soon see a red brick house. From there, he needed to head back toward the center of the city, and his apartment would come into view just a minute later. He still remembered, and this time, without any pain. Kyle smiled. The weather was really nice. It was neither too hot nor too cold. He remembered days in winters past when the whole boardwalk had been a single sheet of ice, or times during the summer when it got so swelteringly hot that hardly anyone dared stay out in the open. Today, in comparison, it was heavenly. He walked by the couple, who didn't even register him, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, he didn't feel like a freak. Yeah, he would get better on his own. Maybe running into that tiny shop really had been too much. He probably just needed to take his time and stop worrying about it. Kyle walked past the big guy still standing at the railing, tucked his cap, and let out a, "Nice weather, hmm?" The head that turned toward him was definitely completely different from what he had expected. Kyle looked up at bloated cheeks, sunken in eyes, and the palest, almost blue skin he had ever seen. His irises were muddy, his teeth shimmered softly behind the bloated, split-up lips. And all of a sudden, he could smell the guy as well. He stank like death. What the fuck? Kyle growled as he stepped back from that monstrosity. But the big, bloated guy still looked at him with this strange sense of urgency. His hands shot up and tried to grab him, but Kyle quickly jumped backward, cursing loudly now. The couple on the bench looked over, but didn't make a move. Fuck off! Kyle hissed at the big, bloated man, who opened his mouth even more, showing stuff that could be algae or seaweed between his rotting teeth. What the fuck was wrong with this guy? Well, he was dead, his mind told him, and judging by the glances of the couple on the bench, Kyle was sure they couldn't see that disgusting monster either. He turned and started to run, then immediately heard the big, bloated corpse groaning pitifully as it gave chase. Kyle could feel his heart racing, and the metal staples in his scalp shifting and stretching his skin at every step. But he couldn't simply stop. He looked back over his shoulder. The behemoth was still running after him with outstretched arms. What the fuck did it want? Was it because he had looked at it, interacted with it? He remembered the guy at the entrance of the hospital. When the taxi had driven off and their eyes had met, he had started moving too. Kyle swallowed hard. Were all dead people like that? Would they start to chase him if they found out he could see them? Or was he having the mother of all breakdowns right now? What if it was just a hallucination? A bleed in his brain? He could feel a cold chill. There wasn't a way to find out right now. He couldn't very well stop and wait for it to catch up to him. If it was real and could touch him, well, he didn't even want to know what it would do. This wasn't how he would end. He was lucky this thing was slower than he was, since the distance grew with every step. But Kyle still told himself to keep on his toes. It wouldn't stop chasing him. Maybe it could find him again? He looked ahead and could already see the red brick house in the distance. As long as he managed to get into his apartment before this thing could catch up to him, he would be safe, right? Kyle sped up even more and felt his stamina already bottoming out. Spending weeks in a hospital had weakened him considerably, and the stress of running wasn't helping either. He could feel the staples in his skin, combined with the stinging pain of sweat touching the edges of the wound. Kyle looked back one more time as he reached the red brick house and could see the thing on the boardwalk, still hurrying after him with its slow, almost slug-like movements. His feet turned toward the small road running past the house, and he finally could jump off the wooden boards and onto asphalt once more. It wouldn't find him, right? He ran and could see more people now slowly walking toward the boardwalk. 4 of them, to be exact. A family, with a mother, a father, and a child in a stroller. And one step behind them, an old woman who looked far too pale and disheveled to be a real part of them. She had long fingernails, sheet-white skin, and sunken eyes that kept staring past her parents and toward the stroller. No young family would let someone like that close to them, right? Not if they could see them. Kyle ran past him and could see the father's eyes narrowing as if he was measuring him up. He didn't mind. Worse was that the old woman looked at him now as well. Their eyes met. For a second, she stopped walking and concentrating on the stroller. Please don't, Kyle prayed in his thoughts. He could feel that chill mid-stride and forced himself to look ahead instead of at the thing. Please, he begged again. Kyle could do nothing but keep running anyway. He didn't dare look back until he finally reached the road and turned a corner. What he saw almost made him stumble. The family had gone on, but the old dead woman was still standing where their eyes had met. She hadn't started coming after him, but something in the way she was staring back at him told him that she would soon. Kyle put a hand over his mouth and ran around the corner, out of sight of the boardwalk and the old woman. Shit. There were dead people everywhere, and they could realize that he could see them too. Kyle sprinted down the road, the pain in his head already turning into a constant, throbbing agony. With the fear and stress, he could hardly concentrate on where he was going. But it didn't matter much. He had walked these parts of the city hundreds, maybe thousands of times. Even if his memory was still spotty, his feet seemed to know exactly where they had to go. He didn't try to steer, but let himself just run along. Across the road, and through an alley with two junkies sitting on the floor. Kyle made sure not to look at them. Every person he encountered might be one of them, his instincts warned him. He jumped out of the alley, turned, and suddenly felt a sharp, piercing pain through his head as he looked up at the old, dark building. 14 floors, with his apartment being in the second to last one. His hand shot into his pocket, ignored the bills this time, and grabbed hold of the keys. He needed to get away from the street, to lose the drowned guy and the old woman. If they were even following him still. No, he couldn't risk it, he told himself. Pushed the key into the lock, ripped open the door, and slammed the entrance shut behind him. It was dark down here, in this old building. He recognized the smell, though. Still the same, he mumbled, and felt the headache slowly subsiding, while his heart was racing. Right now, he wanted to go up to his apartment, to lock the door and to hope that everything would just return to normal. Kyle turned away from the door and toward the elevator. His finger pressed a button, and thankfully, it was already waiting just one floor above. He glanced back toward the entrance. What should he do if the big, bloated guy or the old woman turned up now? Run up the stairs? What then? He could feel his stomach cramping up and his legs starting to shake. Sweat was stinging the top of his head. No, he just needed to get away from the entrance for now. The elevator arrived and opened the automatic door. Just 5 more seconds, Kyle thought. If the ghosts didn't see him enter, they wouldn't know where he had gone, right? He lowered his eyes and walked into the small and cramped cabin, pressed the right button without even looking, and let his back touch the wall as he exhaled. Relief washed over him as the door closed, without so much as a sign of the 2 ghosts that had seen him. Kyle smiled, then suddenly stopped. He was looking down at the floor and could see shoes at the periphery of his vision. Someone was standing in there with him, turned toward him. He could feel it now. 2 eyes were fixated on him, burning him with their gaze. But no one was breathing in the elevator next to him. There was no noise besides the sound of the old mechanism pulling the cabin up, and his own racing heartbeat. Kyle slowly raised his eyes. The black leather dress shoes were still pointing in his direction. He could see dark pants, immaculately pressed. Knees, hips, all angled toward him. He could feel a lump in his throat. The man staring at him was wearing a white shirt tucked into his pants. Cufflinks above dark skin with neatly trimmed fingernails. He could feel it, smell it. A faint odor that didn't belong to him or the elevator. He stopped himself as his eyes reached the man's throat. There, in the dark skin, he could see impressions left by a rope. Kyle felt his legs shaking and had to hold himself up against the wall. Please don't see me, he prayed in his mind. The elevator was still slowly moving up. Time seemed to stretch into eternity. Why hadn't it stopped already? Should he press another button, then jump out? Or would that give him away? The man standing next to him was still staring at him. He hadn't made a move either. Kyle tried to calm down, but he failed miserably. His arms and legs were shaking, and this time it wasn't just from the exhaustion of running. He could feel this pounding headache, the pain crawling along his scalp. His ribs felt like they could be breaking any second now, under the constant assault of his own heart. A whimper escaped his trembling lips. The man still wasn't moving, not a muscle. Kyle wanted to scream. A sudden ding cut into the noise as the elevator stopped and the door opened. Without wasting another moment, he jumped out and raced for the door directly across from the elevator. The one to his apartment. Kyle fumbled around with the keys in one hand while his other hand took out his phone. He needed to call her. Dr. Stein. She had done something to him, right? At least she would know, right? He heard the door in front of him opening, pushed it inward and stepped inside, just as he raised the phone to his ear and listened to the call connecting. Mercy Front Hospital. How may I help you? A female voice asked, and sounded far too cheery in his ears. Kyle could still feel his heart racing out of control. Dr. Stein. I need to talk to Dr. Miranda Stein. This instant. He hissed into the phone. Eyes were looking at him. At his back, to be exact. He knew the door was still open and the elevator still waiting, but he couldn't do much against that. Turning around and shutting it would give him away. All the instincts in his mind told him. This thing would know he could see it, and then... Is this a joke? The woman replied, now sounding agitated. That tone in her voice grated on his already fraying nerves. He put up a hand and massaged the bridge of his nose to not start screaming into his phone. This is an emergency, he groaned, barely containing his anger. Dr. Stein told me this morning to call her if anything changed. So could you please put me through to her? She's been dead for a year, asshole! The voice hissed back, and the call disconnected before he could even utter another sound. Kyle felt the phone slipping from his grasp. No, he whispered in disbelief. He turned around and could see the dead eyes staring at him from the open elevator. The man standing there was smiling. No, grinning from ear to ear. His mouth opened and revealed a row of blood-stained teeth. Kyle whimpered as his legs began to shake. His mind was going blank. The man pushed himself off the wall of the elevator and shot forward, just as Kyle's body turned and started to run. He knew the door wouldn't stop him. This thing would catch him in another second. He screamed and cried and ran. There was the window. Everything was better than this. He could hear this thing roaring in his back as it followed. Kyle jumped. Glass broke around him and cut into his skin as a cold breeze blew past him. He could see it. The streets down there. People were standing around, looking up as he broke through the window. Figures he had seen. the old woman, the bloated corpse, even the doctor. They all looked up at him and raised their hands as he screamed and fell, racing toward them, and then hitting the ground right in their midst.